This video, I'm going to be going over edit mode, sculpt mode, and modifiers. I'm actually just leaving this default cube in the scene, and that's what we're going to start with. And you'll notice that it is pretty simple. It's literally, if we go to wireframe view, it is a 6-sided object, and that is it. Not a lot going on, so let's do something with it. Let's go to edit mode, and in edit mode, you'll see that it has pulled more specifically information around the vertices, edges, and faces. And actually, you have 3 different selection modes at the top left. So you have vertice mode, edge mode, and face mode. And depending on which one of these is active, you will select different things as you are clicking on the object. So here I have face mode active, so anything I select, it will be the edges, or sorry, the faces. But if I have edge mode selected, I will only select the edges. And this is really interesting because once you have pieces selected, you can literally move them around. And so you could really quickly deform objects into being anything you might want. And yeah, I would encourage you to play around with this a bit, especially on this basic cube. No rules. You can go wild with this thing, make some really crazy forms pretty easily. And I haven't even done anything else to it. That's it. So it's really good for us to have all the pieces selected, all the faces selected for what we're about to do. And there are a couple ways you can get around to do this. One would be you just manually select. So if you select one and press shift, you can click another and click another. You just go around, you could do this for all 6, sure. But what if your object has more than 6 faces? This could take a really long time. There are a couple of really quick and dirty ways to do this. The easiest way to select all of this stuff is the selection box, which you just click and drag a box. Depending on what Blender version you're in, it may not select through the object. You may have to swap to X-ray mode and then select all of your faces. But another way that you can do this, which is really handy, is you can say select all up here in the top. So that's handy. And depending on what else you're doing, there are other ways to select specific groups. So you might say select, and you could even select random, and it's going to select random faces on the object. You can do select loops or select linked. Select linked is super interesting and useful because it selects all faces that are on that contiguous object. So if your object is broken into pieces, it would only select the ones that are there. But however you choose to select all of the faces, that's the important thing. What we're going to do next is we're going to right click, which brings up this nice menu, and we're going to say subdivide. And you'll see exactly what that has done immediately. It has subdivided those faces into further geometry. Down here in the bottom right, I have turned on some scene statistics. You'll see if I right click down here on this bottom right of Blender, it allows you to check on some stats. And I have these checked on pretty much all the time just because they don't really get in the way or anything. And it's interesting because you'll see really quickly information about your objects. After I've right-clicked and said subdivide, this subdivision submenu has appeared here in the bottom left. And if I up this count, you'll see that it has further subdivided the count of the polygons, and the faces and edges and tries have all increased. You can have a very complex object very quickly by just upping the subdivision count, but then you'll also notice the complexity of the object also drastically increases, and this kind of poly count is totally fine. It's not going to be a problem until you start getting in the hundreds of thousands to millions range, which is really easy to do actually, so just be aware of that. And this looks like probably more polygons than we would want initially, but we'll just stick with this for the demonstration purposes, and then we will actually up the polygon count even farther before we go into sculpting. But once we have it like this, we can just do some really interesting operations. So here I'm just going to shift select these faces, and of course you can just move them directly, so you could start to really quickly make a complex form just by pushing and pulling different vertices or faces. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to press the I key on the keyboard. This is also available over here on the left via the Inset Faces option. But if I press the I key, you'll see it is creating a sub ring. It is insetting these 4 faces into the middle of these. And so now, if I press the E key, which is also over here on the left, this is the extrude function, I can push or pull that in. And this becomes really handy. Just between the I and the E keys, you can really quickly generate some interesting geometry. And you of course could like very quickly and easily detail something out with that. A lot of hard surface modeling uses this kind of technique to embed some spicy detail. I'm not going to go too much farther on the edit tools, but they're here. What we're actually going to do is I'm going to go straight into the sculpt mode. And of course you could just keep going like this and iterating around, which would be super interesting, but I'm going to go ahead, like I said, I'm just going to select one face, hit Control L to select all the linked faces, and now I'm going to right click and I'm going to subdivide this more. I'm going to subdivide it here. That looks good. You can see I already have 13,000 faces on this now. It's gotten very subdivided. And what we're actually going to do is jump straight up here in the top left from the edit mode into the sculpt mode. It looks exactly the same at the moment, but you'll see that my mouse now has a circular brush around it. And if I, up here in the top, increase the radius, that circle is larger. The strength, you'll see, starts to change the inner circle. On the left, there is a wide range of different sculpting tools. The default tool is actually great. It's called the Draw tool. If you just click and hold, you can immediately start to deform the surface. If you press the Control key, you do the opposite action. And then if you press and hold the Shift key while you click, it is the Smooth tool. And the Smooth brush is also a brush here. So you can adjust the strength on that smoothing function by selecting the Smooth brush, and you can make it super smoothing or just mildly smoothing, depending on how intense you want that operation to be. But I'm just going to spend just a second to just add some ripples onto this thing. And I'll get more in depth on this a bit later. We will be mostly just using the default brush and the smooth brush, but there are a couple of other super interesting ones here, particularly the inflate brush, which kind of puffs geometry out. So between inflate and smooth, you can really quickly make some really bubbly form, and it's nice. If I just go through here, inflate, deflate, deflate by holding Control again, and we'll just see where this ends up. If I just click on this, you'll see exactly what that inflate tool is really doing. It's really like allowing that to bubble out. This is turning out nice. We still have some sharp edges, and now we have these kind of bubbly edges from the sculpting. But you see it's rough here. And that's because the sculpting was hitting the limits on that subdivision. And if I was to render this, you might be able to get away with it. You might not notice. But one trick you can do that can help you quite a bit is to shade smooth on the object. And I just open that option up by right-clicking on the object, and you can toggle between shade flat or right-click or shade smooth, which is pretty cool. We have this kind of interesting object. Let's check out some of the modifiers. The modifiers here are super powerful. There are lots and lots of different ways you can use these things, but actually before we get too far into that, I'm going to make a copy. The easiest and fastest, most effective way to make a copy is to press Shift-D with the object selected, and then you have to click off to place the copy. You'll see it has added a cube 0.001 to my collection here, and now I have 2 versions of this object. I'll just go ahead and make another so we can actually have a nice lineup of them. If we want them to be exactly on the same axes, of course I could just go in here and zero out the X location. So now they're all in a perfect line together. But we have our original object here on the left. Let's take a look at what some modifiers can do to this guy. One of the easiest ones to grab your head around here is, of course, array is pretty easy. It just makes copies in a particular orientation, which is cool. Very similar to Rhino. Decimate, not too uncommon either for 3D software. You can lower the decimation ratio, and you'll see it is just lowering the polygon count progressively. And this can be really handy. You'll notice that the appearance doesn't actually change very much in the upper range. So if your scene is getting too heavy, you may want to decimate some meshes, just depending on what you're dealing with. But you can see you can take it all the way down to a triangle, just 3 surfaces. If, for example, I want to apply this, let's say I want to really reduce the polygon count. I'm going to reduce it all the way down to 17%, and I want this to be what the object is now. I have to actually apply the modifier, because if you don't apply it, it remains on here as a procedural operation, which is really handy for some of the things because you can actually stack and layer modifiers together, and then if you change earlier things in the stack, it iterates that all the way through the stack. But for some purposes, you'll want to bake those modifiers into the objects. And to do that, you have to click this little pull down arrow and hit apply. Now that modifier and that geometry is permanently decimated, which is why I was making a copy. If you apply something and you don't have a copy, you may lose that original version unless you revert your file to a previous save. So I encourage you to make copies if the object isn't too heavy, or just leave the modifiers as procedural. Let's take a look at this next one. So that was decimate. Another really cool one is, okay, there are a lot of cool ones here. I think wireframe is a pretty cool one to just see what it does. You can immediately make a wireframe. This is pretty sweet for architecture stuff. A lot of framework pieces can be quite interesting and intricate. To change some of the settings on it, you can just change the thickness on those pieces by just typing in new numbers on that. If I type in 1, you'll see that it gets crazy. It's not really made to do that. You might just want to play with some of those settings there. You can even just change some of these factors as well. But this is a great one to show an example of how the modifier stack actually works. I'll go ahead and make a copy of this even to show you. On this copy, I will apply the modifier. And now if I was to enter into sculpt mode and sculpt it, I'm sculpting on that new geometry. So you'll see I have the inflate brush, so it is literally inflating the struts. It is literally inflating that mesh, the wireframe mesh. But if we go to this object and we go to its sculpt mode, this modifier is not applied. And so when I am inflating, it's actually still inflating the original geometry before the modifier is applied. You'll see that huge difference, right? The same sculpt tool is applied. This was the results on this one, but this was the results on this one. And just depending on what you're doing, you may want it one way or the other. And sometimes you might just need to try it both ways to see what it's going to do. You never know. Let's take another copy of that original object. The holy grail to me in Blender, though, is a pair of modifiers. The subdivision surface modifier is super duper handy, but you have to be very careful because it rapidly subdivides and smooths out your meshes. I'll cover that in a second, but before we get to it, I'm going to show you the remesh modifier. And the remesh modifier is insanely cool. It also rapidly subdivides meshes and can cause some file bloat for sure if you're not careful. But the remesh tool gives you several ways to rebuild your mesh. And the blocks one is honestly one of my favorites. It instantly and easily voxelizes your model. To control it, you can just play with these 3 settings, really. The scale is how closely it's fitting to the original form. So if I put it all the way up to 0.99, it will be much closer to the original form. But then really, what you'll be mostly playing with, and honestly being careful with, is the octree depth. And this really is the resolution on the remesh. if you up the octree depth, you'll see it is getting much closer to the original form. The cubes that are remeshing it are getting smaller. And you can generate some really interesting work with this, but you'll notice down at the bottom as I do this, the polygon count explodes rapidly. Just be careful with this. Octree depth of 8 will probably, depending on the mesh, it could really start slowing down your computer. I've pushed them up higher than this, but everything gets really slow after that. So just be careful. But they have 3 of these kind of octree depth modes to go through. So they have the blocks mode, which voxelizes, the smooth mode, which kind of rebuilds it, but out of smoother geometry, and then the sharp mode, which does it out of sharper polygons. Voxel out of this set is the unique one. Instead of rebuilding it out of a specific kind of preset type of geometry, it is just slicing this into voxels. Imagine there's an invisible 3-dimensional grid around this, and it is then approximating the geometry based off that grid. And this number, you actually want it to be smaller. So the smaller the voxel size, the closer it will be to the original geometry. I'll just cut this number in half by typing 0.05, and you'll see it gets even tighter. And you can actually push this really far, and you can push it so far that it will show all of the imperfections in the original geometry. For example, here, where these faces were flat, single faces, now it's still flat, but it's actually thousands of polygons instead, which isn't necessarily good. But you'll see that the polygon count is over 600,000 now, and it's gotten really heavy. It's done some interesting stuff though, and this can be great for sculpting, honestly, because now the polygon count is super duper high. So if I apply this remesh, go into sculpt mode, my sculpting operations are going to have a lot of fidelity, and it's going to make a very smooth model if I start to smooth it out. For doing something like character sculpting, you may end up actually wanting to push geometry to this level. But between all these modifiers, that should really cover the basics of what we might want to do.